Minister, taxi drivers have been staging protests over Uber, a €1 billion company that's pushing a fixed fare model onto drivers, and they held a briefing here in the Dáil yesterday where representatives reported that this model, if it succeeds, could cut the earnings of many drivers by 30 to 50% and undercut those who don't even use Uber as well. So significant repercussions for the 22,000 licensed taxi drivers, a very important cohort of the workforce in this country. It would also potentially lead to a massive increase in work hours, with the implications of that for fatigue and public safety. They described it, Minister, as a bombshell. They were very emotional, in fact, talking about the vilification they've endured on social media, for example, for the action that they took in recent weeks. Now, the Irish taxi system is regulated to protect drivers' livelihoods and to protect a customer service for the general public. It's governed by the NTA on behalf of the government. It's licensed, it's guarded vetted, vehicle standards and a public fare review every 2 years that the public can feed into, that taxi drivers have rejected increases in themselves. So is the government at all concerned that that system of regulation is threatened by massive corporations that are not even based in this country, that don't necessarily pay tax in this country? The fixed fare option for passengers can look great in theory. No matter what event happens, a road closure, a diversion, toll, a crash or whatever, they will not pay more than that price. Any of the extra costs, however, time lost, extra fuel, are borne completely by the drivers. But passengers shouldn't be fooled. In the US, from 2018 to 2024, Uber increased its prices by 18% per year. At the same time, drivers lost 12%, were getting 12% less than under the previous model. So they get it in and then they ramp up the charges. I don't have time to explain it, but this dynamic pricing that these apps are using is completely different to anything that's gone before. They're using AI, they're using behavioural patterns of individual drivers. They're following, the type of fares they normally take. They're sending them fares that they think that they will. They're completely individualising it. The CEO of Uber talked about offering the right trip at the right price to the right driver. They monitor work patterns and they ultimately then monitor each driver to increase their profits. And the model allows Uber to sell a driver's time to a passenger for the maximum that they can get while paying the driver the minimum that they will accept. Now, Minister, I just want to finish by asking you just to pose the question. First of all, why didn't the Minister meet the taxi drivers yesterday rather than sending officials in to the taxi driver committee? Will you ensure that the publicly managed, regulated system of taxi driving is maintained? Will you ensure that algorithms are not allowed to decide the fare structure in this country or the conditions that workers have
Minister
to tolerate?
Donovan.
Thanks very much, Les Corla, and thanks to the Deputy for raising what is an important issue, particularly this time of the year. I think we all should be really cognisant of and reminded of the great work that taxi drivers do and hackney drivers do as well all over the country in bringing us home safely in communities across the country, particularly when we're all so anxious to make sure that people don't drink and drive and we want people to go out and enjoy themselves, and the reliance on nighttime economy workers like taxi drivers and hackney drivers is very important. And Minister O'Brien, Deputy Coppinger, is on government business abroad at the moment, and I agree with you. I don't think anybody should be vilified for any approach that they take with regard to their relationships with either state structures or anything else, and I just like to put that on the record. Les Corla. The Minister wrote to the NTA to request clarification on the regulatory position on the Uber fixed price fare for the information of taxi operators and public reps alike. In the responses letter, the Minister has been advised by the NTA that the charging of a fixed price fare is in accordance with the applicable regulations, and he has also been advised that the NTA continues to keep the regulatory model under review. The Minister instructed his senior officials from the department to meet with the NTA to discuss the response. And following the meeting, which took place on Tuesday the 9th of December, the Minister formally requested the urgent consideration of the matter by the Advisory Committee on Small Public Service Vehicles, and this is to take place today. And I think it's important, and I'm sure the Deputy will agree with me, it's important that these discussions are allowed to take place without feeling pressurised from anybody, including anybody in the House here. And the Advisory Committee on Small Public Service Vehicles is an independent body established under the Taxi Regs of 2013, and its primary function is to provide advice to the NTA as the regulator and to the Minister for Transport in relation to taxis, hackneys and their drivers. And members of the committee include drivers, operators, representatives of consumer interests, disability interests, local governments and Garda Síochána and the tourism sector. So I would hope that after today we might have a greater degree of clarity. I know that the Minister is, as I said, on government business abroad at the moment, and I'm sure that when he returns to the House next week, we will have greater clarity with regard to this. Lascan Corla.
Ruth Coppinger.
Well, I think there's two things that need to happen. I think the drivers need to boycott Uber. I think everybody here, TDs and public figures, should say that they won't use Uber for what they are doing to these drivers. But however, Minister, that isn't sufficient because we need to legislate as well. So will you prohibit the use of algorithms to set fares? Will you legislate to prohibit apps acting as third parties in negotiations on the fare between passengers and drivers? Will you, I'm not saying they can't negotiate, but that negotiations would have to be done human to human. Will you conduct an urgent review of the app-based taxi fare models and their compliance with taxi regulations? Now, in the answer you said that the NTA have said that this is in accordance with the regulations. They're exploiting something whereby a driver can agree to take a lower fare from somebody who can only afford to pay, for example, €20 when it should be 25. A goodwill gesture, if you like. A woman who might be stuck at night being brought home. And that's been used by these companies, that loophole, to bring in this fixed fare model. Minister, lastly, will you develop a publicly managed NTA taxi hailing app? Why rely on these massive corporations that are only interested in greed and profit to set the standards for public transport in this country?
Yeah, thanks, Lascan Corla. And the Deputy will be aware, Lascan Corla, that the NTA is an independent transport regulator of the taxi sector, and it's not for the Minister for Transport to intervene in the day-to-day operations of the sector, no more than it is for any minister who has set up or has under their remit a regulatory authority, whether it's health in my own department, justice or wherever. It's not within the ambit or the remit of the minister, the line minister, to interfere in the day-to-day operations of the regulatory authority. But what I think is important here is, based on the information that's been made available to me by the Department of Transport, there's an opportunity today for deoxygenated, I suppose in many ways, to have a discussion around this between the two parties that are critical to it, hoping that they can arrive at something that will be a workable solution. And I would encourage people to allow them the space and the time to do that, particularly at the time of the year, because all of our towns and cities rely to a massive degree, particularly for Christmas shopping, Christmas parties and everything else, for our taxi and hackney drivers. And I hope, you know, at the end of the day that we can get a resolution. The Minister will be back in the House, I'm sure, next week, and there will be other opportunities either in the Transport Committee or here in the Dáil itself to raise the matter directly with him.